All right, welcome everybody. This is our first SQL Server with Access Academy chat. We're going to have 3 of these. This is today's part 1 introduction. Then we got intermediate next month in October. I hope that you join us for that, as well as advanced in November, where we treat advanced topics on SQL Server. So we're really excited about this format. You know, one of the reasons that I decided to launch the Academy is, first of all, 2 things. Number 1, SQL Server technology does advance quite a bit throughout the year. And number 2, there's still a lot of people who would like to learn more about Access with SQL Server. And so this is the yearly introduction to that, right, where you can come on board and get some instruction and some insight onto how to go about using Access with SQL Server. So I hope you enjoy it. We are recording it. We'll have this recording made available later on. So one of the things that I wanted to say is about me is I'm a Microsoft Access MVP. My specialty is Access with SQL Server. I travel the world speaking on this topic. This year I was in Vienna for the conference in Vienna. And then later after that I was in Oregon for the POG conference, and then Dallas for SQL Server. So this is something that's near and dear to my heart. I believe that Access with SQL Server is an amazing combination. And I tell people that I'm an expert optimizing Microsoft Access with SQL Server. I'm not an expert on SQL Server. And so in that sense, I want that to be clear. I mean, if you ask me about high availability clusters, I'm not going to be able to answer that for you, right? Why? But if you start asking me questions on how I can optimize a view for access, that I'm all over. So just keep that in mind, that we're talking about optimizing access to work with SQL Server. My Twitter handle is @jsoto22. You can reach me on LinkedIn, and please connect with me. I accept all connections on LinkedIn, and there's my email if you want to email me as well. All right, so before we get started, look, I'm going to assume that we have people in the audience who've never used SQL Server. So let's go ahead and do a quick poll. If you've never used Access SQL Server, can you just say me never on the comments there? Never have, never used. I'd like to know how many people who are with us today who've never used Access SQL Server. And so to that end, I'm going to assume some of you have not, and I'm going to list these definitions here for you. SQL means Structured Query Language, and there's an ANSI standard for that. And then I see a couple nevers there. Thank you very much. T-SQL. It's Microsoft's adaptation of SQL, ANSI. And so I believe that T stands for transaction. SQL Server, and sometimes we say SQL Server, sometimes we say SQL. SQL Server is a database server that's sold by Microsoft. And the Express version, which is free, we're going to talk about that later on in the presentation. It's called SQL Server Express. And then there's a developer edition. And then the other 2 I wanted to mention was SSMS and SSMA, SQL Server Management Studio, and SQL Server Migration Assistant for Access. So those are some of the terms that we'll be talking about today. All right. So one of the reasons that I want to touch briefly on is, why would you want to use SQL Server at all with Access, right? Why SQL Server? And it really boils down to several things. Number 1, just the other day, last week, I was at a plant here in Chicago that does long bolts for Caterpillar. Caterpillar produces like agricultural equipment. And they called me, and they were calling me in a real bind because their mission-critical access application went down. So when I go into the tables, I notice there's some Chinese characters, and that's indication of corruption. Don't ask me why there's Chinese characters. If somebody in the audience knows why we get Chinese characters when there's corruption, please let us know in the comments there. But you know, it's a sign, right? Especially if it's an app that's poorly designed. And this particular app had an Access front end and an Access back end, so it's unusual to see that kind of corruption, but it still occurred in this case. And SQL Server handles so many more users than Access. You know, if we've had databases with 100 users on it, and you can only accommodate that many users if you're using a combination of Access SQL Server. And then if you ever tried using Access over VPN, you'll know quickly that's way too slow. I'm not saying it's not doable, but VPN is just agonizingly slow. To me, it's not worth it to use Access over VPN. But if the data resides in SQL Server, then yes, it will work fine over VPN. Provided that you follow all the other recommendations we're going to be talking about today. And then one of the nice things I love about SQL Server is data integrity. Security integration with Active Directory or using SQL Server Security, which is if you used to use the old workgroup file in Access, you know that's no longer supported in 2016. And so you have to come up with your own security schema. Yes, you can password protect a file, but that doesn't help you in terms of roles or users. And so having the ability to provide that kind of complex security to Access really is a boon when you integrate that with Active Directory. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later in the presentation. And then, honestly, I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. Just the other day still, I walked into a client customer's office, and they were storing Social Security numbers in their Access database. And I had to write them a letter and tell them, look, you can't really have Social Security numbers in your database because it's not safe. And so somebody can easily copy this file to the thumb drive, walk out the door with it, right? So Social Security number, addresses, credit cards, big no-no. Better to move that to SQL Server, and there's several advantages to that. Number one, you can enforce encryption if you have the enterprise license of SQL Server between SQL Server and Access, right? So that avoids the man-in-the-middle attack. Number two, you can encrypt columns or tables in SQL Server. So if somebody were to steal your database in SQL Server, they still wouldn't be able to access that data unless they have their certificates. And then, it's sometimes what I tell clients is, look, if you got this field, Social Security number, which for those of you who are not in the U.S., that's how you get a credit card here in the United States, is with the Social Security number. I tell them, look, does every employee need to have access to that number field, that SQL Server number field? And invariably, we can get away with only a few key employees seeing the full field and everybody else seeing the last 4 characters. So it's something that I always bring up when I walk into a new customer and I see these security vulnerabilities. And it looks like I forgot my R there, SQL Server. But look, if SQL Server may be overkill in these situations, right? You got 1 or 2 users, maybe 3. There's no internet, there's no LAN, and we had a call once here from a company that paints cell phone towers. And they called us up and says, no, we'd like to be able to have you develop a database so that when our people go to these cell phone towers, they can document the condition of the tower, what they painted, how they did it. And so I started asking them questions. Well, sometimes it turns out sometimes these towers are reached via a helicopter, and they have no internet, they have no cell phone connection. So that's a bad case because you would have to install SQL Server on the local laptop, and then had to do some sort of synchronization, and the client wasn't interested in that, and I wasn't going to propose that. That would be overkill. And the last reason is when you may have a lot of data, right? If you don't have a lot of data, maybe SQL Server is not for you. Oh, Susan, can you provide my email? Somebody's asking about that. And somebody provided a link there. Actually reports that databases are in inconsistent state. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that link. And that was Klaus. Thank you, Klaus. All right. So this is something I asked. I do teasers for my chats on the web, and one of the teasers I send out is, what is the first thing you need to do before you migrate to SQL Server? Right? What is the very first thing? And so I got some interesting responses back. Somebody said backups. If that gentleman is in the audience, please raise your hand there. But one of the things that you really need to do is you need to fix your access issues first, right? if you've got tables with no primary keys, if it's slow, if the logic is broken, if it's buggy, if the users are complaining about this or complaining about that, you really need to fix those issues, and then you can upgrade to SQL Server, because if you don't do that, what's going to happen is the SQL Server is going to magnify those problems, right? So if you had a slow system before, and you're hoping that SQL Server is going to fix that issue, it may even be slower once you upgrade to SQL Server. And I'll talk about that in a second here. And so, the very first thing is when I go start a new SQL Server conversion project is I tell the clients, look, we need to address these issues before we can upgrade, because otherwise it's just not going to work out. I'm not saying you can't, but it makes your life easier if you can fix these things first. All right, so there are several flavors of SQL Server. There's the Developer Edition. There's the Express Edition. There's even SQL Azure. Which one would be the one you should use? Well, you would have to see what the final application is going to be hosted with, right? So if in my case, if I have a client that's using SQL Enterprise, I want to use SQL Server Developer Edition to do my development. And the other thing is, by the way, you want to match what the client has. You don't want to develop in SQL Server 2017 and then you realize that they have SQL Server 2008. So one of the very first questions I ask is, what is your current version of SQL Server? And each one of these editions have, except for Azure Service, the first two, Develop and Express, have a corresponding version, right? So if they're using 2008, then you should get SQL Server Express 2008, SQL Server Developer Edition 2008. So that's something to keep in mind. There are, however, limitations to SQL Server Express, right? There's and these limitations, I'm going to talk about a little bit about their impact. Number one, you can only have one CPU. So it doesn't matter if you have an 8-core or a 16-core server. If you install SQL Server Express, it's going to throttle it to only one CPU. It only uses 1 gig of RAM. With SQL Server Enterprise, if you have 120 gigabyte RAM, it will use all 120 if you're not careful. But SQL Server Express only uses 1. And there's a limitation in terms of the size of the database, 11 gigabytes. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, then why would I use SQL Server Express, right? If it has these severe limitations. Well, even with these severe limitations I'm talking about here, they're not severe. They're actually, SQL Server Express is actually an upgrade over an Access front end, back end, by the mere fact that it's a server product. No, it's 11 gigabytes. Somebody's asking 11 or 10. It's 11 gigabytes of database size. So SQL Server Express is a server product. Your backend file is not a server. So SQL Server Express is going to always beat out an Access backend, even with these severe limitations, to the point where, of all the projects that we've done over the years at IT Impact, 99% of them was with SQL Server Express. It works just fine. And the client doesn't have to purchase an enterprise license. Because enterprise license is not cheap. It can run you anywhere between $7,000 and $12,000. And really, you got to be careful with the client, because some clients may not have the funds to buy that, right? Or they may rather invest the funds in your development time as opposed to buying the SQL Server. So SQL Server Express can run circles around just a pure Access backend file, because of the fact that it's a server and still have all the great features SQL Server has, like views, stored procedures, CTEs, CLRs, and everything else. So the nice thing about SQL Server Express is it can run on a PC, right? And so can SQL Server Enterprise. But honestly, if you're going to spend $12,000 on SQL Server Enterprise, you probably want to purchase a server. So a lot of times a client of mine may not have the funds for a server, although these days you can buy a server honestly for $1,000. But sometimes they'll say, you know what, I have a high-end PC, and they'll install it on there and they leave it in the corner, and that's fine. Sometimes they'll run it on a PC that's being used by another user, which I don't recommend. I say, look, come on, this is a mission-critical app. The last thing you want to do is have somebody install on somebody's PC to use it. But if it's a low-impact database and there's only 1 or 2 users, that's fine. So it's just a wonderful combination. I just love SQL Server Express, and that should be your go-to, right? We got some MVPs in the audience today. Jack, welcome. Thank you for your comments. Jack is the organizer of POG. And by the way, next year POG is not going to be in May. POG is going to be later on in the year. And I'm going to ask Jack to post the link for the conference to POG, and also specify when he's going to start selling, because it invariably sells out every year, and you want to buy your tickets as soon as possible. And so when you're talking about access with SQL Server, right, what is that what you must become, right? Well, first of all, get it out of your mind that all you need to do is move the data to SQL Server and you're done, right? I'm going to use SSMS, SQL Server Migration Assistant. I'm going to upgrade my tables to SQL Server. I'm going to link it back to my original application, and I'm done. It's in SQL Server. All right, that will work. I'm not saying it won't work, but in a lot of situations you'll find that it may even be slower, right? If you have a complex query with 6-8 tables in it, and your SQL Server is on a high volume network, and there's 15 people on your Access front end, it can very well be a drag if all you do is stop with just creating the linked tables. And so one of the objectives of these chats is to give you the opportunity to learn how to optimize, right? I want to be able to transfer my knowledge to you guys so that you're successful in using SQL Server. And thus, it's just not enough to link the tables most of the time. Most of the time, you also need to create views and even create store procedures, which we'll cover in our advanced class in November. So what you really need to know in order to optimize access to SQL Server is you need to learn how to design tables. In SQL Server for Access, yes, there is a methodology of how to specifically design tables for Access, from SQL Server. You need to learn the query syntax. You need to learn how to use SQL Server Management Studio. And then eventually, if you really want to turbocharge your development, right, you want to learn CTEs, which is Common Table Expressions, and store procedures. And so the question is, what must you become? The answer is you must become a SQL Server developer. Now, when I started down this journey 20 years ago, I was hell-bent on learning this technology. And my personal experience was very pleasant. I love the tools. SQL Server Management Studio is a modern developer tool that is going to make it very easy on you to quickly learn SQL syntax. I found that IntelliSense and SQL Server Management Studio was great. I just felt that it was a transformation for me to go from VBA to T-SQL and be able to really use all these tools. So I am hoping that you'll have that same kind of transformation as I did, and be able to appreciate it and learn it and be able to take advantage of it in your projects. Look, you can use Visual Studio, but as an Access developer, somebody asked me why SSMS over Visual Studio. As an Access developer, I'll tell you that I didn't want to get into the weeds with Visual Studio, right? I mean, I had never learned C#. I'm not saying that I won't ever, but I've never learned C#. And so SSMS is fine in order to be able to be an expert in optimizing access to SQL Server. All right, so I'm going to be posting this presentation later on the web, and I got these links here for you. But these are simple searches, right? You can simply go to the Microsoft website and get these. Now, for SQL Server Express, for the last one, SQL Server Migration Assistant for Access, I'm going to exit out of the presentation here and show you that specific site because there is an issue I want you to see about. All right, can you guys see the browser I have here with the Microsoft website up? All right. Okay, so when you go here, this is the SQL Server Migration System 7.1 for Access. And all right, by the way, before you can install the assistant, so here are the steps, right? The first step, install SQL Server Express, step number 1. Step number 2, or Developer Edition. Or step number 2, install Management Studio. If the last time you probably downloaded SQL Server was a while back, you probably are used to getting SSMS as part of a download of SQL Server. Microsoft has since separated SSMS into its own install. And you can get the latest version of SSMS. It'll work with any version of SQL Server. So it's a great way to maximize the use of SQL SMS and still use it with older SQL servers, 2008, 2012, and so forth. So once you've done that, then you're ready to download SQL Server Migration Assistant for Access. All right, so you get to this download page, and Microsoft done a really good job here lately of making it easy. You're going to click on this download button. There's a point you want to make. You can get these two options. This is a 64-bit, which you would download for Office 64. And this is the 32-bit, which says 86. Anytime you see x86 on the file name, that's for 32-bit. They really don't do a good job of explaining that here on the site. But that's the version you want to get if your Office's version is 32-bit, right? So get the version that matches your Office. All right, so once you have that downloaded, then you'll be able to start your migration. Now, before I get to my demo and use SSMA, we really need to talk about the design principles. When you create tables in SQL Server, you'll need to make sure each table has a primary key. Now, why is that important? Because if you don't have a primary key, Microsoft is actually going to treat that as a read-only table. And this is a typical mistake a junior developer will make, which is to create a table without a primary key. Now, in Access, when you try doing that, it'll say, hey, you haven't added a primary key. Can I add one for you? SSMS won't do that, right? SQL Server Management Studio will let you do whatever you need to do, but it's not going to say, would you like a primary key with that? And, and Access is very forgiving when it comes to Access tables. So I could create an Access application without any primary keys and act with an Access backend, and it's going to be not ideal, but it will work. Access will let you create tables without primary keys. You want to make sure you have a primary key with SQL Server. In Access as well, anytime a field ends with ID, right, such as customer ID or order ID, Access will automatically add a foreign key for you in that Access table. Not so SQL Server. You need to add those foreign keys yourself. When it comes to yes/no fields, we're so used to using them in Access. They're a great field. They're used for check marks. They're called bit fields in SQL Server. You want to make sure that defaults to 0. So you want to add that default to 0. And then you want to, of course, avoid reserved words, just like you can in Access. There are more reserved words in SQL Server, such as plan. The word plan is a reserved word, so avoid using that. And then make sure there's a timestamp field in every table. Now, timestamp alerts Access to when was the last time that record was modified. It's a field that's only used by Access in SQL Server. You would never program a query against it. You would never look at the data. It doesn't make any sense to us. Specifically designed for Access to be able to see when that table was. And every table that you create in SQL Server should have the timestamp field, right? Just one. Now, there's a caveat to that, and that is if you add a timestamp to a table, two users will not be able to edit the same record. That usually is not a problem for me. And there were runs to come across that. All right, so we have a newer version of SQL Server 7.8. Thank you very much, Klaus. I'm sorry about that. That's another problem with SQL Server that Microsoft, they don't really help you download the latest version. I'll make sure I modify my presenter files when I download this. Now, after I say all of that regarding designing of access tables, after I say all of that, you probably wonder, well, that's a lot of work. But I'm going to show you. For those of you who've never designed a SQL Server table, I'm going to bring up the SQL Server here. I already have a database ready to go. All right, so when you log into SQL Server, this is my local desktop machine. I can then specify the database I am, and then here I'm going to right-click and create a new table. All right. So again, I'm going to say, let's go call it this order table. So I'm going to need an order ID field.
You need to switch your screen.
All right. You're not seeing my. Let me exit out.
Only seeing your presentation.
All right. How about now? Do you see SSMS now? Can you see that here?
I'm not.
I can see it.
All right, great. Thank you. So I went in here and I right-clicked on, right-click and select table. That brought me onto the table designer tool here. And let me just pin this here to there. Jack, can you see it now? All right, I'm assuming you can. So I've added this field order ID. I use integer, right? I click on here. Now this is going to be my primary key. Now I can do this several ways. The easiest way is I can right-click and set primary key. When I do that, notice that it automatically unchecks the allow nulls. Now in Access, you have the ability to automatically change this to an auto number. Not so here. The auto number, you'll never see auto number here. Instead, if you want this to be an auto number field, in SQL Server it's called something else. So I'm going to come down here. It's called an identity field. So I'm going to click here, identity specification. And I'm going to just switch this property to yes. And then the nice thing about this, I can actually specify an initial seed for this identity, which you can't do with Access. So for example, sometimes I'll migrate an existing system from Access to SQL Server, and the last order ID was, I don't know, 12,000. So what I'll do is I'll say, I'm going to start with 20,000. So now the client knows that any order number with 20,000 or greater was created after we went live. So that's a little technique there you can use when you go in there. So I've got it in my first field, made it a primary key, and then you're going to have order status, ID, right? Integer, and you may have the customer ID, another int, and you can have